Ryan Anderson.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I just want to make clear I'm speaking in my personal capacity here today, but for identification purposes, I'm the William E. Simon Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. I'm also a doctoral candidate at the University of Notre Dame in political science. And I'll be speaking from that perspective of political science, from the perspective of philosophy and social science, really answering the question of what is marriage. I've co-authored a book and an article that was in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. You're being distributed copies of that book with a classmate of mine from Princeton, where I was an undergraduate, and with a professor of ours of constitutional law at Princeton, Robert George. We then filed amicus briefs with the Ninth, the Tenth, and the First Circuit Courts, and with the U.S. Supreme Court. The title of that book, the title of that Harvard article is What is Marriage? The answer to that question is something we didn't hear today from people on the other side. It's interesting that we've had a 3-hour conversation about marriage without much by way of answering of that question. Everyone in this room is in favor of marriage equality. The only way we can know whether or not any given state law is treating marriage equally or not is if we know what a marriage is. Because every state law will draw lines between what is a marriage and what isn't a marriage. If we want those lines to be drawn on principle, if we want those lines to be drawn on the truth, we have to know what sort of a relationship a marriage is as compared to other forms of consenting, adult, loving relationships. So in the time I have today, I'll just answer 3 questions. What is marriage? Why does marriage matter for public policy? And then what are the consequences of redefining marriage? Marriage exists to unite a man and a woman as husband and wife to then be equipped to be mother and father to any children that that union produces. It's based on the biological fact that men and women are distinct and complementary. It's based on the anthropological truth that reproduction requires a man and a woman. It's based on the social reality that children deserve a mother and a father. Whenever a child is born, a mother will always be close by. That's a fact of biology. The question for culture and the question for law is, will a father be close by? And if so, for how long? Marriage is the institution that different cultures and societies across time and place developed to maximize the likelihood that that man commits to that woman, and then the two of them take responsibility to raise that child. Part of this is based on the reality there's no such thing as parenting in the abstract. There's mothering and there's fathering. Men and women bring different gifts to the parenting enterprise. Rutgers sociologist Professor David Popenoe writes, quote, "The burden of social science evidence supports the idea that gender differentiating parenting is important for human development, and the contribution of fathers to child rearing is unique and irreplaceable." He then concludes, quote, "We should disavow the notion that mommies can make good daddies, just as we should disavow the popular notion that daddies can make good mommies. The two sexes are different to the core, and each is necessary, culturally and biologically, for the optimal development of a human being." This is why, when we look at the map with all of the states, so many states have continued to define marriage as the union of a man and a woman, many doing so by amending their constitution. The impact of marriage. So why does marriage matter for public policy? Perhaps there's no better way to analyze this than looking to our own president, President Barack Obama. Let me quote, "We know the statistics that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They are more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from home or become teenage parents themselves. And the foundation of our community are weaker because of it." There's a host of social science evidence. We go through the litany and we cite all of the studies, chapters, and verse in the book that you've been distributed. But President Obama sums it up very well. What we've seen in the past 50 years, since the war on poverty began, is that the family has collapsed. At one point in America, virtually every child was given the gift of a married mother and father. Those numbers right now, it's more than 50% of Hispanic children are born outside of wedlock. More than 70% of African Americans are born outside of wedlock. And the consequences for those children are really serious. The state's interest in marriage is not that it cares about my love life or your love life or anyone's love life just for the sake of romance. The state's interest in marriage is ensuring that those kids have fathers who are involved in their lives. And so what we saw was that this was when the welfare state took off. This is when all of the welfare spending that bankrupts so many states and the federal government took off. It's when crime increased. It's when child poverty for those children increased. It's when social mobility decreased. So everything that you can care about, if you're someone who cares about social justice and limited government, if you care about freedom and liberty and you care about the poor, is better served by having the state define marriage correctly to ensure that men and women commit to each other and take responsibility for their children, while then leaving other consenting adults free to live and to love how they choose, without redefining the institution, the fundamental institution of marriage. One thing I will add to that is that insofar as there are debates, we've already mentioned hospital visitation, which the federal government has already addressed. We can mention inheritance laws. Every individual has those concerns. I am not married. When I get sick, I need someone to visit me in the hospital. When I die, I need someone to inherit my wealth. That situation is not unique to a same-sex couple. That is a situation that matters for all of us, and so we need not redefine marriage to craft policy that will serve all citizens. Lastly, I'll close with 3 things about how redefining marriage will undermine the institution of marriage. You hear this question, how does redefining marriage hurt you or your marriage? I'll just mention 3 in the remaining time that I have. First, it fundamentally reorients the institution of marriage away from the needs and the rights of children and towards the desires of adults. It no longer makes marriage primarily about ensuring the type of family life that's ideal for kids. It makes it more about adult romance. If the biggest social problem we face right now in the United States is absentee dads, how will we insist that fathers are essential when the law redefines marriage to make fathers optional? Much of the testimony we heard today was about the special interest pleading of big business, wanting to appeal to the elite college graduates from the East and the West Coast. We heard no discussion about the citizens of Indiana, the children who need fathers involved in their lives. Redefining marriage would make it much harder for the law to teach that those fathers are essential. Second, if you redefine marriage so as to say that the male-female aspect of marriage is irrational and arbitrary, what principle for policy and for law will retain the other 3 historic components of marriage? In the United States, it's always been a monogamous union, a sexually exclusive union, and a permanent union. And we've already seen new words created to challenge each and every one of those items. Throuple is a 3-person couple. New York Magazine reports that. It's in the book. Here's the question. If I were to sue and say, I demand marriage equality for my throuple, what principle would deny marriage equality to the throuple once you say that male and female is irrational and arbitrary? The way that we got to monogamy, the way that we got to the number 2, was that it's one man and one woman who can unite in the type of action that can create new life and who can provide that new life with one mom and one dad. Once you say that is irrational and arbitrary and nothing except hate and bigotry and animus, the way that the other side has consistently demonized those on my side, you will have no principled reason in law or in culture or in policy to retain the number 2. Likewise, the term wed lease has been developed. A wed lease is a play on the term wedlock. It's for a temporary marriage union. If marriage is primarily about adult romance, romance can come and it can go. Why should the law presume it to be permanent? And then lastly, the term monogamish. Wed lease was introduced in the Washington Post in 2013. Monogamish was introduced in the New York Times in 2011. And it said, no, we should retain the number 2, but they should be sexually open relationships. That it should just be 2 people getting married, but they should be free to have sex outside of marriage, provided there's no coercion or deceit. Now, whatever you think about group marriage, whatever you think about temporary marriage, whatever you think about sexually open marriage, as far as adults living and loving how they choose, think about the social consequences if that's the direction, the slippery slope in which marriage redefinition would go. For every additional sexual partner I have, and for the shorter lived those relationships are, the greater the chances that I create children with multiple women without commitment either to those mothers or to those kids. It increases the likelihood of creating fragmented families, and then big government will step in to pick up the pieces with a host of welfare programs that truly drain the economic prospects of all of our states. Finally, I'll mention liberty concerns, religious liberty in particular. We saw in Massachusetts, we saw in Washington, D.C., where I currently live, and we saw your neighbor, Illinois, after they passed either civil union laws or redefinition of marriage laws, that Christian, Catholic, and evangelical adoption agencies were forced to stop serving some of the most neediest children in America, orphans. These agencies said, we have no problem with same-sex couples adopting from other agencies, but we only want to place our children with a married mom and a dad. We have religious liberty interests. We also have social science that suggests children do best with a married mom and dad. In all 3 jurisdictions, they were told they could not do that. So what's at stake here, and we've also seen in different jurisdictions instances of photographers and bakers and florists and innkeepers, people acting in the commercial sphere who say we don't want to be coerced. And that's what redefining marriage would do. Redefining marriage would say that every institution has to treat two people of the same sex as if they're married, even if those institutions don't believe that they're married. So the coercion works in the exact opposite direction of what we frequently have heard. Everyone right now is free to live and to love how they want. You can work for a business that will give you marriage benefits if the business chooses to. You can go to a liberal house of worship and have a marriage ceremony if the house of worship chooses to. What would be at stake with redefining marriage is whether or not the law would now coerce these institutions into treating a same-sex relationship as if it's a marriage, even when it violates the conscience and the rights of those individuals in those institutions. So for all of those reasons, this is why the state and all states have an interest in preserving the definition of marriage as a union permanent and exclusive of a man and a woman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Okay, thank you.